Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you work, you're still not able to match the vision that's actually in your head? And you see, what's interesting about that is, see, you've done everything that you were told to do, but you're still starting to realize that your efforts are just not good enough. And so I have a question for you. What if the problem isn't in your efforts? What if the problem is actually in the way of how you've been told of actually how to make money? And you see, what's funny about that is, see, oftentimes we have been told that one of the ways of how to make income is that we have to work for somebody else. And so, could that be a problem if we've only been told one way of how to make income, but there actually is more incomes out there that we can actually partake into? Could that be an issue for us? Yes, it is. Okay. And so, what we're going to talk about, and I'm actually go to the board and visualize this in a second, but it's interesting how we have subconsciously started to believe just because we've been only told one way that there actually is one way. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. Okay. So I'm about to go to the board here and we're going to actually demonstrate exactly what it is we're talking about. Okay. So we're now going to discuss the 4 levels of how you can actually make income. So this is actually called the Cashflow Quadrant, what we're about to talk about. And this is actually designed by a person named Robert Kiyosaki. He's actually the person that written the book called Rich Dad Poor Dad. Okay. But he also written another book that was called Rich Dad's Cashflow Quadrant. So you'll be able to find exactly what we're talking about in that book. Okay. So again, we have been conditioned that, again, that in school, they've told us that in order for you to be successful, you had to go out there and, get good grades. Okay. But then what those good grades were supposed to provide you is these massive opportunities for you then to actually get some of the best forms of education. Okay. To then, furthermore, after getting this high end degree, that you're then having a more further opportunity than most people to then actually get some of the most high paying jobs. But what they don't tell you is that just because you go out here and get this degree, that still doesn't mean necessarily that you actually are going to get that job, because now you're competing for maybe 100 people are literally trying to do that same job and there may be actually one position. And so what's funny about that is, again, we have only been designed to believe that there's one way of how to make income is to, again, just be an employee and work for somebody else. Okay. And so again, the easiest way for us to understand again what an employee is us simply agreeing to terms that our boss is now giving us, and they're saying that it is in our best interest to make sure that we're willing to work those 40 hours a week, right? And so if we're willing to do that and make sure that we're actually being diligent with our assignment, okay, to actually deliver in the deliverables of what they're asking us to do, then they would guarantee us for us to actually get paid maybe every 2 weeks, bi-weekly, bi-monthly, so on and so forth. Just whatever you guys agree to. This is an agreement between you and your employer that says in order for you to get paid, you have to be willing to trade your time for money. Okay. So what happens is sometimes some people start to ask themselves the important questions. Well, if I'm working for my boss, how is it that my boss doesn't even have a boss? And so now they're starting to ask themselves the right questions because, again, they've only been conditioned that in order for them to be successful, they had to go out there, get good grades, and then now be able just to work for somebody else. But see, now they're starting to understand that there might be actually another way that they haven't been told about. And so let's say if they're an electrician, for example, and here it is, their boss is now telling them to go out to certain locations where, something may have happened in their home and they have to be the repairman to have to actually repair, their electricity or whatever the case is. And all of a sudden they're starting to realize, well, my boss is not the one that's doing this labor. He might not even have a degree in electrical engineering, but how is it that he's actually able to make more money than me? Right? Is that a fair question? Absolutely. So now at this point, they're starting to get curious as what if I were to start my own business that then furthermore could allow me to keep all the money and then not have to pay anybody else on payroll. Okay. And so then that leads us into the next quadrant, right? And this is actually what is called self-employed. Okay. Now, the easiest way for us to understand what being self-employed is I'm going to ask you for a second. What is the first fast food restaurant that you can think of? The first thing that comes to your mind. What's the first one that comes to your mind? Okay, McDonald's. Brilliant. Now, the funny thing about that is, see, I don't even eat McDonald's, but somehow that's even the first thing that I think about too. So it's just funny how that works. But anyway, right? So list out a few of those roles that we know of that we personally could be able to visualize. Okay, this person is over that role and everything else. What would see managing? Okay, so people managing others, keeping them up to date with what's going on. Okay, fantastic. Anything else? Okay, somebody's cooking. Absolutely. Somebody gotta be flipping those burgers. 1000%. Absolutely. Fantastic. Anything else? Exactly. Somebody is now working with cashier. Fantastic. Perfect. Anything else? Yes, somebody's now doing drive-through. Fantastic. Fantastic. So let's just play with some of these for a second. So the easiest way for us to understand what it actually means to be self-employed is that simply all of these tasks that we listed out is normally meant for somebody else to be doing specifically those individual roles. But what happens is when somebody is self-employed, that's them now taking responsibility over every single one of those roles. And so what happens is now you're the person that's having to manage the business, right? You're also having to be the cook. Okay. So the moment that somebody comes to the drive through, you're now having to work the phones. Okay. Then furthermore, you have to go out there and try to flip the burgers, make sure that the order is right and all these other things. So now you're managing that of what you're already doing. And then you're having to ring them up. Okay. And see, this is the problem because see, there are certain things on this list that we know that still has to happen behind the scenes, even if we don't see them. Okay. So what about being the actual CEO, the visionary of that McDonald's franchise? Right. So what happens is you are literally putting on all these different hats. You're putting one on, you're taking one off, you're putting one on, you're taking one off. We didn't even talk about the fact that after you're now doing all of this cooking, what then would you have to do? Eventually, you're going to have to clean. So now what happens is, even though somebody may say it's not a significant role, it becomes furthermore significant because now you could be now affecting the actual quality of the food. You could be getting somebody sick if you choose not to do this. You see? And so here it is. We understand that there's so many different roles that has to be fulfilled in order for you to successfully be able to satisfy your customers and most importantly, actually get paid because you're delivering a service to them, whether you know it or not. And so this is what happens most of the time is that people start to rely on their own efforts to being able to make money. And that's not the best way on how to do it. And this is why 95% of the actual population is finding themselves trading their time in order to make money. And that's only the reason as to why they're only able to tap in to 5% of the actual income over the entire world. Imagine that. We're talking about 95% of the population is actually on this side trading their time for money, thinking that's the only way to how to make money. And this is the reason why they're all having to split between just 5% of the entire income of the entire world. That's a lot of mouths to feed. And so this is why this way over here and everything that it comes with, you start to feel like the more time that you're willing to give up, the more money that you start to make. But again, you're limiting it because anything that you add on to or even multiply, if you're already operating off of a limited result, which is your physical efforts, at some point you might get sick. And so what happens if now you can't physically show up or do these services? Automatically, there goes your income too, right? We understand? Okay, perfect. So could we see that this is a problem for us? Absolutely. So wouldn't it be in our best of interest to figure out what is the right hand side of money of how to get to the right hand side? Would you like to know? Fantastic. So that now leads us into the last two elements that would actually allow us to understand how we can really get to our goals if we were specifically wanting to actually understand that we could now have more time to spend with our families and not feel like we have to constantly keep trading that time in order to provide for our family. Okay. So the next quadrant that we have to getting onto the right hand side of money is the B quadrant that refers to an actual business. Okay. And so the difference between these is vastly different because you see, the employer mindset, they believe that just because they started a business, that somehow means that they are being able to have or consider themselves actually as being a business owner. But that's not necessarily true. Because you see, when you have an actual business, instead of the business operating on your efforts, you're actually allowing the business to run off of systems. Okay. So that business owner understands that they have to be willing to create systems that can then operate outside of them. And they don't have to now physically be there because they can now do two things. They can either be the person that has actually created the system itself for other people to operate in, or they find somebody else that's willing to create them this system so that they can then show other people how to operate in their system. Make sense? And so now what happens is you are now, instead of you just again operating on your own efforts, you're actually leveraging other people's efforts so that they can then be the money printing machine of what happens in your business. So whether you decide to come in or not, you are now still going to keep getting paid as long as they're willing to operate into that system. Okay. So this is why McDonald's runs maybe over 1,500 different locations. And the CEO, there's no way for the CEO to have to be at all of those, physical locations. It's impossible, right? And so this is why when we are looking at the system itself of how it runs, this is why you have multiple different people in those positions so that everybody knows what it is that they're doing. And most importantly, when they stay into that environment long enough, they will become even more proficient at what it is that they actually do. Okay. And so now that we realize that there's a significant difference between being self employed versus actually being a business owner, we then can actually shift our efforts to what is this last quadrant. Okay. And so this last quadrant represents the I quadrant. Okay. And so this quadrant is now talking about your investors. Okay. So now this one here is king. Okay. Because even though these two go hand in hand, they're like your peanut butter to your jelly. Okay. And so even though they go really good with each other, oftentimes you realize when somebody may start to understand that there's other ways of how to make income other than just being an employee, right? Working for somebody else. So when they're wanting to get onto the right hand side of money, some people may not actually be wanting to create business. Okay. And so what happens is, even if you didn't want to necessarily create a business, you still have the opportunity that, let's say, even if you decided you still wanted to work for somebody else, that's completely fine, right? But the understanding of what happens in this level is vastly different because, see, what operates on this quadrant is now instead of you creating systems that can make you money, you're actually allowing the income that's coming in to have your money make you money. Okay. So what happens is this is how somebody that, again, that's employed can still be able to contribute to being an investor by just knowing maybe even what businesses they can actually invest into. And so now what happens is they don't have to create the system. They're not the people that necessarily have to run the business. And they don't even need to be the people that have to come in and see the facility and all these other things. But because they are investing their resources into this company in order for it to continue to keep growing as other ones may do too, what happens is when the business grows, your investment grows as well. And so imagine that this is what literally allows you to start buying back your time and rescuing it from loss because you're starting to understand that now everything on this side is not you having to trade your time in order to make money. And this is now why 5% of the population that are actually on the side are actually now able to tap into 95% of the actual income of the entire world. That's a big difference. And so when people are now saying that I'm just not making enough money, if I would have just only had more money, that all my problems would then go away. But I would disagree heavily because, see, the thing is, money has never necessarily been the actual problem to why you're feeling burnt out, to why you may be even feeling tired, right? And so we just have to understand that when you're willing to operate everything on the left hand side, you also get the backlash of everything that the left hand side provides to you, feeling burned out and tired. Okay. But see, when you operating on this side, you start to realize there's not a cap on how many businesses you can have. Because again, the business is not operating off of you. The business is operating off of the system that you may have created or allow somebody else to create. And then furthermore, being able to get the revenue that comes with that. And then furthermore, being able to open up the opportunities for other people to get paid. Right. And so then now working our way back to the investor that again, whatever quadrant you decide to make money in, you can still maximize the opportunity to divide those efforts with just being able to understand that this is the opportunity where you can really allow your money to make you money so that now you're actually being able to diversify your income. Okay. And so these are the elements that we have to understand. It's not enough, first off, for us to now just become aware of this. Your life does not actually change until you actually start to implement this. And so this is why I always like to share, this thought with people because we have been told that knowledge is power. But I would heavily disagree because anytime there has been a situation where you may have written a book or read a book, if that, how has that book actually changed your life if you just only read that book and said it was just an amazing book? Is that going to change your life? There you go. And so what we're starting to understand is even though we're starting to realize it's not necessarily the way of knowledge is power, because anything that's half of the truth is automatically just a lie. And so when we're operating now in the lies, again, we're only going to be able to get that of what that lie produced in our lives. And so we have to remember that the truth itself is when we actually understand that the applied knowledge is power. So when you're willing to actually start operating in such a way that you're creating systems that one day, if you did decide to become self-employed, there's nothing wrong with becoming self-employed unless you do not have the understanding to know that eventually your self-employment could operate so much better when you actually are running off of a system. And so sometimes, yes, you may have to be the implementer. Sometimes, yes, you might have to be, the person, especially if you're running a business, you're also the promoter, right? But just understand that as the cash flow is starting to come in, because now you start to understand the most efficient way of how to make income, you then can start delegating those assignments to those people that need to be in those management roles. So they then can start to show people what it is they need to be doing when it comes out to cooking and all these different things. So that again, you can continue to focus on the actual business itself as being that visionary. Where is it that we need to be going so that we can continue to keep solving other people's problems? So they're gladly willing to pay us because we're willing to solve their problems with an elegant solution that we've provided. Okay. And so this is why it's important for us to understand, just simply said. Okay. And so then some people may even ask, well, if the cash flow quadrant is so important for us to know, why is it that we didn't learn this in the past? And I would say that is a great question. I think it's a lot of questions that most people would have. But I got to ask you again, is we then have to go furthermore back into, well, why is school designed even in the first place? Okay. Because see, the thing about school is, for starters, they're not teaching about what it means to be an entrepreneur. Why? Because they're ideal people that are coming in through school. They're wanting to show them what to think but they're not showing them how to think. And so what happens is when they're showing them what to think, it allows for them to control every action that they do after and make them believe that it's in their best of interest as to why now we have people that are saying, oh, I want to work at this job for about 40 years of my life to then eventually retire. But you never had necessarily the desire to do that, but you have been trained to believe that that's in your best of interest to actually go and work for somebody else until you get to the age of 65 so that you just don't have to work another day in your life. And so my problem that I have with that is if we again see that 95% of the population is doing this model, trading their time for money, what then happens when you do reach up to 65 and instead of you just not relying on your own efforts or what they've told you, if you did not take the opportunity to look and see what has actually happened when other people actually reach the age of 65. Are they happy? Are they sad? Or are they fulfilled? Because see, they've been told that at the age of 65, they no longer have to work. But see, I have had countless conversations with people that once when they reach to the age of 65, they start to realize something called inflation. Inflation is a real thing. So imagine if your income is staying the same each year, year by year, but everything that you know is starting to increase in value. We're talking about just food. We're talking about gas, right? We're talking about literally just your way of living is starting to continue to increase. So if everything else around you is increasing, but your income is not, could that be a problem for you? Right. And so what now happens when you continue to operate in a system that is just allowing only 5% of people to have to split between all of them? This is why that's the faulty way. And this is why when you understand how to get onto the right hand side of money, then you can forever change your life. But it's not until again you operate in it. Okay. And so, funny story is I actually was a victim to this because I was actually working at a place called Shell Elevator Corporation. Okay. As an electrical engineer. And there was something that happened. Okay. Something that most people didn't expect, the COVID. Okay. And so it was funny enough that most people would say that, electrical engineers, have this amazing job security and all these different things because you need them, right? Well, how is it that as being an electrical engineer and then getting faced with, I call it a pandemic, right? How is it that all of a sudden we are no longer needed and then we get even further laid off for the efforts of what we can no longer be able to serve people of a business? Because see, that business model, we were creating escalators. So imagine you're creating escalators for businesses that are continuing to wanting to keep, having other businesses being built all around, stayed around, and all these other things. So when that business of other businesses were no longer creating actual buildings for us to actually give them the product that they wanted, there went our business model. And so what now happens when your employees, you're no longer able to pay them because we're not able to get the fulfillment of actually being able to, give the product to these businesses, right? And so they had to start making some significant amount of cuts, right? And so the reason why I'm sharing this is there's a lot of people right now that are falling victim to only just having one source of income. And I like to say one source of income is just one step away from no source of income. So the reason why we're going into so much detail as to why this is so important is because if you don't have another source of income, then what happens to you and your family? Are you going to be the person that now is going to be saying, okay, well, because, I got fired or whatever the case is, then now this is the reason as to why I can't provide for my family? And it was interesting because I had that same conversation with my boy. And they told me that was like, oh, well, absolutely not. That wouldn't make no sense. And why? It's because we are putting the opportunities at front for us to understand that again, it is not their fault for them as to why we can't be able to provide for our family. Okay. And so the reason as to why I want to continue to share this is if I didn't have another source of income where I was tapping into my business, helping other people to solve their problems, and then furthermore, being able to use that income to then multiply my money, then I wouldn't have been able to provide for my family. So it's important for us to understand that the money that is coming in, you invest that so then it can multiply in your efforts. So that way you're not allowing yourself to be fixated and fighting for the crumbs at the bottom. And so again, if this video has blessed you in any kind of way, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because at the end of the day, your success is my success. And here it is. Just want to give you the opportunities that can forever change the trajectory of you and your family. So with that, stay blessed.